Have you ever wondered what it's really like to have a billionaire father? I'm Fontaine, 33, and trust me, it isn't the fairy tale you picture. My dad owns half the luxury coastline in the Carolinas. He dines with governors. He wears a watch worth more than most people's homes. And the afternoon I married a man with grease under his fingernails, my father stood up at my own wedding and erased me in a single sentence. No inheritance, no trust fund. My husband just smiled and gave him 4 words back. The whole room went still. My mother cried right on schedule, but none of them knew where my husband actually worked or what I had quietly built on my own while they laughed at me. 6 months later, they would find out, in front of 500 people, at the worst possible moment for my father's empire. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the people who underestimate you learn, far too late, exactly who they were dealing with. If a story has ever pressed on a bruise you forgot you had, you're in the right place. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe, because this one earns it. Now let me take you back to the dinner where my father handed me an ultimatum and called it love. The dinner happened on a Thursday. At the long table that looked out over the water my father liked to say he owned. He didn't own the ocean. He just owned the view, the resort, and most of the people sitting at the table. A bottle of Krug breathed by his elbow. His Vacheron caught the candlelight every time he reached for the oysters, which he did slowly, the way men do when they want you to wait. I've arranged for you to meet Preston Vance on Saturday, he said, not looking up. The Vance merger is nearly closed. It would help things along if you two were seen together. I set down my fork. My grandfather had taught me to do small things with my hands when I needed to stay calm, and without thinking, I ran my thumb along the worn brass calipers I still carried in my bag, the ones Walter had pressed into my palm the year before he died. I'm seeing someone, Dad, I said. It's serious. That got his attention. Seeing whom? What family? You don't know him. The candles hissed. My mother's smile froze into something brittle. My father set down the oyster he'd been savoring and looked at me the way he looked at a property he'd decided not to buy. In this family, he said, marriage is a merger. Sentiment is for people who can't afford strategy. I didn't tell him Owen's name. I didn't tell him Owen would never fit at this table, and that I meant it as the highest compliment I knew. I only smiled and let the silence sit there, because some answers are better delivered later, in person, with a much bigger audience. He had me investigated, of course. That was the Porter way. 3 days later, I was summoned to his office on the top floor of the flagship resort, where the windows ran from the carpet to the ceiling, and the chairs were chosen to make you feel smaller than you were. A slim folder sat on the desk. Owen Hale, my father read, flat as a contract. Aircraft mechanic, rents a hangar at a regional field, no real estate, no assets to speak of, no family connections worth the ink. He closed the folder and looked at me. This is what you're throwing the Vance merger away for? A man who fixes other people's engines for a living? He's a good man. Good men don't build legacies, Fontaine. They get hired by the people who do. He stood and walked to the glass, hands behind his back. Let me be clear so there's no confusion later. Porters don't marry mechanics. I'd heard that flatness before, the day he refused to pay for my engineering degree because it was a lurid little hobby for a Porter daughter. I paid for it myself, nights and weekends, and I built things with my own 2 hands while my sister was handed a debut and a wardrobe. You taught me to build things, Dad, I said evenly. Don't act surprised I built a life you didn't approve. He laughed once, short and dry. There was one odd thing in that folder, though, and it stayed with me for weeks. The investigator had found nothing. No debts, no scandal, no past. For a man as ordinary as my father claimed Owen was, his record was strangely, deliberately clean, and I didn't yet understand why. I'd met Owen 4 months earlier and not at a party. I met him at work, which is the only place I've ever felt entirely like myself. A regional field had hired my firm to assess the structure of an old hangar before they expanded it, and I spent a morning crawling its trusses with a flashlight and a notebook. The whole building hummed, There's a sound a turbine makes when a jet spools up 2 bays over, a low climbing whine you feel in your sternum before you hear it. And I loved it the way other people love music. A man in coveralls was wiping his hands near the doors, watching me measure a corroded gusset plate. The name stitched on his chest read Tidewater, a regional outfit I half recognized. "That plate's been lying to inspectors for a decade," he said. "Tell me what you see." So I told him, and instead of nodding politely the way men do, he argued, and he was right twice, and wrong once, and he admitted the once. We talked for 2 hours. He asked what I'd build if nobody was paying me and nobody was watching, which is a question no one in my family had ever thought to ask. He paid for our coffee in cash, a worn fold of bills, and steered us away from the nice place down the road toward a diner with cracked vinyl booths. I noticed the pilots nodded to him a beat too respectfully for a line mechanic. I noticed, and I filed it away, and I let it go, because he was looking at me like the work mattered, and the work was the realest thing I had. "I don't care whose daughter you are," he said when he walked me out. I believed him. He proposed in the hangar, which was perfect, because that was where I was most myself. No string quartet, no rooftop, no ring chosen by a personal shopper. He'd machined a band himself on the lathe in the back, simple titanium, slightly imperfect at the seam, and he was nervous in a way I'd never seen him. "I can't give you the life they planned," he said, "but I'll never make you small." I said yes before he finished. Telling my family was a different machine entirely. I gave them 2 months' notice, the way you'd warn someone before setting off a controlled demolition. My sister Brooke heard within the hour and posted a story to her 200,000 followers, a photo of a wrench captioned, "Bold choice, hope love keeps the lights on," followed by a laughing emoji. Preston Vance, the heir my father had picked for me, went around telling people he'd dodged something. My mother called and breathed into the phone for a full minute before speaking. And my father, when he finally called, did not raise his voice, which was always worse. "You want a wedding?" he said. "Fine. I'll give you a wedding you won't forget." I should have heard the threat folded inside the gift. I didn't, because I was happy. And happiness makes you generous about people who haven't earned it. I told Owen what my father had said, expecting him to worry. He just nodded slowly, like a man checking the weather before a flight he intended to make anyway. "Let him plan whatever he wants," Owen said. "We'll still be married at the end of it." That calm should have told me something about who I'd actually agreed to marry. It didn't. Not yet. My mother arrived 2 days later with a folder of bridal magazines and a face arranged for grief. Diane Porter does sorrow the way other women do contouring, with patience and excellent lighting. She didn't ask if I was happy. She asked what people would say. "Do you understand what this does to us?" she said, dabbing a dry eye. "Your father has spent 30 years on this name. You're tearing the whole thing down for a man who smells like motor oil." I told her motor oil was a smell I'd grown to love. She set down the magazines like they'd insulted her. "Don't make me choose, Fontaine," she said. And there it was, the line she'd used my whole life, the one that always meant she'd already chosen and wanted me to apologize for noticing. I gripped the brass calipers in my bag until the knurled edge bit my palm, because Walter used to say that a measurement doesn't care how you feel about it, and neither should you. "You already chose, Mom," I said. "A long time ago." She flinched, and for a second something real moved behind the performance. "Your grandfather," she started. "Before he passed, he told me, he asked me to make sure you—" And then she stopped. Hard. The way you slam a drawer you didn't mean to open. "Never mind." "Make sure I what?" I asked. "It doesn't matter now." She gathered her magazines and her grief and left, and I sat there a long time afterward turning that unfinished sentence over in my hands like a part that didn't fit any assembly I knew. Walter had asked her to make sure of something, about me, and she had decided I wasn't allowed to hear the rest. The first card declined at a fabric shop of all places, while I was paying for swatches. Then the second. Then the small advisory stipend I earned consulting for the Family Foundation simply stopped. No email, no call, just a number that turned to zero overnight. By the end of the week, my father had pulled every thread that ran back to him, the way you'd repossess a car at midnight so the neighbors don't see. The society friends went quietly, which hurt worse than if they'd slammed doors. A text from a woman I'd known since prep school. "So sorry, babe. You understand? Daddy does business with your father." Another. "Nothing personal." 28 years of birthday parties, reduced to a line item someone decided not to keep. Here's what my father misjudged, and it's the same thing arrogant men always misjudge. He thought cutting my access was the same as cutting my legs. I didn't cry in that fabric shop. I went home, opened a spreadsheet, and did what I'd been trained to do, which is calculate load before panic. Rent, groceries, my own modest savings, the consulting contracts I could chase that had nothing to do with the Porter name. The math was tight, but the math held. Owen found me at the kitchen table that night and offered gently to cover everything. I told him no, and I meant it. "I need to stand on my own feet first," I said. "Then you can stand next to me." He didn't argue. He just put a hand on my shoulder and let me work. My father had canceled a credit card. He hadn't canceled my hands, or my license, or the engine of a brain he'd spent my whole life pretending was decorative. We moved into a small clapboard house near the field, the kind of place my mother would have called charming through clenched teeth. It had good light, a porch that caught the afternoon, and a kitchen barely wide enough for two people who liked each other. I loved it more than any room I'd grown up in. But Owen, I was starting to notice, did not entirely add up. He'd take calls late, on the porch, voice low, and the words that drifted in weren't mechanic words. "Push the maintenance window," he said one night. "No, I'll handle the board, don't loop in legal yet." A mechanic doesn't have a board. I didn't ask, because we'd agreed early that we'd earn each other's truths, instead of demanding them. The next morning, a trade magazine sat on our table, left there by one of his colleagues, and the cover story was about an aviation company I'd vaguely heard of, with a headline about its reclusive founder, the billionaire who still turns his own wrenches. There was no photograph of the man's face, just a gloved hand on a turbine blade. I glanced at it, thought it was a nice story about somebody else, and poured my coffee. Owen watched me from the doorway with an expression I couldn't read, something between hope and dread, the look of a man waiting to see whether you'll figure out a secret he half wants found. "Money's just a tool, Fawn," he said, almost to himself. "I'd rather you trust the man than the toolbox." I laughed and told him he sounded like a fortune cookie. He smiled, but he didn't laugh, and later I'd understand that he'd been telling me the truth right out loud, and I just hadn't learned to hear it yet. Let me pause here, because if you've ever been told your choices embarrass the family, you already know exactly how this part feels. I read every comment, so tell me, has anyone ever measured your worth in dollars and come up short? Hit subscribe if you want to see this turn all the way around, because the moment my father's face finally changed is coming, and I promise you it was worth the wait. Back to the story. We'd planned something small, a chapel on the water, 50 chairs, the people who'd actually shown up for us. We arrived to find the parking lot full of cars that cost more than the chapel. My father had invited 200 of his world, uninvited, and seated them himself. He'd even had a seating chart printed, a thick cream card on an easel by the door, and when I found my own family's table, I understood the message. He'd placed Owen at the very back, beside the emergency exit under a hand-lettered placard that read, "Guest. Not groom. Guest." The room smelled of expensive perfume and quiet contempt. Preston Vance was there, leaning against a column with a glass of something amber, watching me the way a man watches a deal he's still hoping to salvage. My mother sat in the front row in funeral gray. Brooke had her phone up before I'd finished walking the aisle, filming, narrating softly to her followers. I found Owen by the back exit, exactly where the chart had banished him, and he was the calmest person in the building. "Your dad has a flair for theater," he murmured. He does, I said. He always saves the speech for the end. We were married anyway. The vows were ours, plain and true. And for 90 seconds the whole machine my father had built fell away, and it was just the two of us, and a tired efficient, and the water outside the windows. Then I heard it, the small bright sound of a knife tapping crystal, and I turned. And my father was rising from his seat at the head of a table he had appointed himself master of, lifting a glass, clearing his throat, smiling like a man about to do you an enormous favor. A toast, my father said, and the room went obediently silent, because that's what rooms do for men like him. To my daughter, and to her, he paused, savoring it, her husband. The pause did the work an insult would have. I built everything we have from a single motel my own father lost, he went on, pacing now, glass in hand, the governor's wife watching from table 4. Every dollar, every door, earned, and I had one hope, that my daughter would carry it forward with someone worthy of the name. He stopped beside Owen, looked down at him, at the clean but unfancy suit, the careful hands. Instead, she chose a grease stain on the family name. A few people laughed. Phones came up. I felt Brooke's camera swing toward me, hungry. So let me be useful, my father said, turning to face his audience like a man delivering good news. As of today, Fontaine is no longer a Porter in any way that matters. No inheritance, no trust fund, not one share of anything I've built. She is a mechanic's wife, and she may enjoy the life she has chosen. He let it land. The room held its breath, waiting to see if I would break, which is the only entertainment that interests people like the ones he'd invited. My mother dabbed at an eye and said nothing, defended nothing, did the thing she always did, which was to perform the wound while feeding the knife. I did not break. I stood very straight, the way Walter taught me to stand when a load is heavier than it looks, and I let my father finish his performance, because I had learned a long time ago that the loudest man in the room is usually the one with the least left to say. Then Owen stood up. He did it slowly, the way he did everything, like a man who'd never once been hurried by another person's panic. He buttoned his unremarkable jacket and faced my father across that ridiculous room, and he smiled. And the smile was the thing that made the back of my neck go cold, because it wasn't angry. It was patient. Thank you for the toast, Mr. Porter, he said, and his voice carried without effort. And thank you for the inheritance speech. My father waited for begging. We don't need it. 4 words, plain as a torque spec. The room rustled. My father laughed too loud. You don't need it, you rent a hangar. I do, Owen said. Best money I spend. And what exactly do you imagine you bring to my daughter's life? Owen considered the question seriously, as if it deserved it. Respect, he said. And the truth, when she's ready for it. At a table near the windows, an older man in a quiet, beautifully cut suit rose and inclined his head toward Owen. Just slightly, the way you'd salute a captain. I'd later learn he ran Owen's company day to day. My father didn't know him from any other guest, and for one flickering instant my father's certainty wobbled. The smallest hairline crack in all that polished stone, the look of a man who has miscounted something and can't yet see where. Porters don't marry mechanics, my father said again, reaching for the line like a handrail. Owen only nodded, agreeable, almost kind. You'll understand my work soon enough, sir, he said. Everyone does, eventually. Then he sat back down beside me, took my hand under the table and squeezed it once, and I felt, for the first time all day, that the room was about to belong to us. My father had taken his shot. It was my turn, and I didn't reach for a glass or a knife to tap it. I just stood and faced the room he'd packed against me. My father believes a person is worth what they inherit, I said. I used to believe it too. I spent 28 years trying to be valuable to him. I let that sit. I went to the right schools. I learned the right smile, and the most he ever called my work was a hobby. Someone shifted, uncomfortable. So I paid for my own degree, on nights he didn't know about, and I learned to build things that hold weight, real weight, the kind that doesn't care about your last name. I looked at my mother, who could not look back. Today I didn't lose a family, I just stopped auditioning for one. There was a silence, and then, from somewhere near the middle of the room, a single pair of hands began to clap, and then another, and then a surprising number. Not everyone, but more than my father expected, including, I noticed, several of his own guests who had perhaps spent their own years auditioning for someone. "The door is right there," I said gently. "If you came for a tragedy, I'm sorry to disappoint you. This is a wedding. Stay and celebrate. Or go." My father's jaw worked. He'd built a room to watch me crumble, and the room had, quietly, mutinously, declined to watch. About 30 people gathered their things and left. More than 200 stayed, which was the one outcome he had not planned for, because men who only understand leverage never understand that some people respond to dignity, and that dignity, it turns out, is contagious in a way contempt never is. My father left then, my mother trailing him, Brooke pausing only to film the centerpiece as if it had personally wronged her. The instant the door closed behind them, the room exhaled. The pressure that had filled it for an hour simply lifted, and the strangers who'd stayed began, awkwardly and then warmly, to act like wedding guests. Someone found the music. The caterer, a local woman my father had not hired, brought out a sheet cake from a bakery in town, white with a slightly crooked seam of buttercream, and it was the best cake I have ever eaten, partly because nobody at that table was performing anything. Owen and I danced badly in the cleared space between the chairs. "Any regrets?" he asked, his chin on the top of my head. "Not 1 second of it." "Even the seating chart?" "Especially the seating chart." He laughed for real this time, and then his face went quieter. "When the time is right," he said, "I'm going to tell you everything. About the work. About all of it." I pulled back to look at him. "Why not now?" "Because you'd hear it differently now," he said. "And because I want to be standing somewhere that proves it, not just saying words." I let it go, because I trusted him. And because the music was good and the cake was gone, and for one evening nobody was measuring me against anyone. I had no idea that the place Owen wanted to be standing, when the truth finally came out, would be a stage in front of 500 people, and that the worst seat in the house would belong to the man who'd spent the afternoon assigning everyone else's. 2 weeks after the wedding, a lawyer I'd never met called and asked me to come in. Her name was Ruth Maddox, and she'd represented my grandfather Walter for 30 years before he died. Her office smelled of old paper and lemon polish. "Your grandfather left instructions," she said, sliding a thin file across the desk, "that certain things passed to you only once you married someone of your own choosing, without your father's approval. You triggered that 2 weeks ago." Inside the file was a single object wrapped in cloth, and I knew the weight before I unwrapped it. His brass calipers, the good set. The ones I'd watched him use 1,000 times, the twin of the worn pair I already carried. And a letter, in his careful draftsman's hand. "He wrote this 14 months before he passed," Ruth said quietly. "He asked your mother to give it to you. She returned it to me last spring, unopened, and asked me to keep it sealed." I read it twice. Walter had wanted me to have his old machine shop, the cinderblock building behind the original motel, the place he'd taught me to measure. And something else. A 12% stake in a small structural components company he'd quietly funded years earlier, a company that, the letter noted in his blunt way, had licensed that damping bracket you sketched in high school and never thought twice about. My patent. The one I'd filed as a broke undergraduate and forgotten. "Has this been earning?" I asked. Ruth's mouth twitched. "For about 6 years. So here is the concrete thing I want you to hold on to, the way I held those calipers in that office until the metal warmed in my hand. My grandfather had left me a workshop, a share of a company, and a piece of my own teenage cleverness. And my mother had hidden all of it from me, sealed in a lawyer's drawer, for nearly a year. I didn't tell Owen the numbers right away. I wanted to sit with them, the way you sit with a structure before you trust it. The Porter name had slammed every grand door in the state, but it turned out the doors I actually wanted were the ones it had never reached. A marina needed a failing dock assessed. A community college wanted its old gymnasium rated for a new roof load. A small developer in the next county hired me on a Tuesday and referred 2 friends by Friday. Real work, done well, travels by word of mouth in a way no surname can buy. Then I drove out to Walter's old shop, unlocked it for the first time in years, and stood in the cool dim with the smell of cutting oil still in the walls. His tools were where he'd left them. I called the components company my grandfather had funded, introduced myself as the engineer behind the damping bracket, and listened, a little stunned, while a polite man explained how many bridges and parking structures now used my forgotten high school sketch, and what 12% of 6 profitable years amounted to. It was not a fortune by my father's measure. By mine, it was something better. It was freedom I had built myself, with a brain my family had spent 3 decades calling a hobby, and it had been quietly paying me the entire time they were busy deciding I was worthless. Turns out, I told Owen that night, finally, the thing they called a waste has been earning behind their backs for years. He grinned, that slow grin. Sounds like you didn't need rescuing. I never did, I said, and the funny thing was, saying it out loud, I realized it had always been true. The story was in the trade press all month, and even my father couldn't keep it off the business pages. Porter Resorts was about to open its crown jewel, a billion-dollar flagship up the coast, and the whole concept hinged on a single promise stamped across the brochures: private jet to your suite, no terminal, no waiting, the kind of seamlessness only the very rich pay to ignore. That promise lived or died on one exclusive partner, the company that would own the airfield, the fleet, and the operation behind it. The name printed in every article was Meridian Aviation Group. I read it the way you read a word you've seen somewhere harmless, in a trade headline, on a hangar sign. And underneath, the detail every reporter circled. My father had been chasing Meridian's signature for nearly 2 years, courting a chairman so private that not one of them had ever met him face to face. The contract was reportedly days from closing, and without it, the flagship couldn't deliver the one thing it had already sold to a waiting list of billionaires. That evening, Owen came in from the porch, and somewhere across the field, a jet spooled up. That low, climbing whine I'd loved since the day we met. And the sound and the name brushed against each other in my mind for half a second before I let them drift apart again, because the idea was too large to hold. Long day? I asked. Couple of contracts, he said, hanging his keys. One big one finally coming to a head,